Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next sustainability webinar. And today we're looking at getting the board on board, the business case for sustainability. And as I look at that date, the 12th of April, it is my daughter's birthday today, and she's not even home. She's busy on a road trip on the east coast of Australia. But yes, a significant date for me, the 12th of April. However, back to business. As always, I'm joined by Ashley Bleeker, a director in ESG and sustainability at BDO here in Melbourne.
Good morning, Aletta.
Morning, Ashley. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respect to elders past and present. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Now, as you know, our sustainability webinar series for this year, initially we only scheduled 6, but very shortly we'll schedule the next 6 for the second half of the year. Over the last few months, we've put a bit of a sustainability spotlight on a number of different frameworks. And in February, we looked at addressing your carbon footprint and referred to the greenhouse gas protocol. Next month, we will continue that spotlight on sustainability frameworks, and we look at GRI standards. And then very importantly, in June, we'll talk about approaching 30 June 2023 and what you should do around sustainability in your financial report. But also if you want to do a separate sustainability report. In our other webinar series where we look at IFRS and corporate reporting, last month we've looked at the imminent IFRS S1, and this month, next week, we will be looking at IFRS S2 and what that would mean for Australian organisations. Very interestingly, just last week, the International Sustainability Standards Board have decided to provide additional transitional relief to entities when they implement the international sustainability standards. And they said in the first year, they want everybody to focus on IFRS S2 around climate disclosures. And only in the second year, go back and circle back to IFRS S1, which are the general sustainability risks and opportunities. So next week, we'll focus on the one that will be a mandatory first, IFRS S2. And this is the place where, Ashley, I'll hand over to you to do a little bit of an introduction and talking about the board sustainability mandate, and then I'll pick it up a little bit later. So over to you.
No problem. Thanks, Aletta. I think without wanting to be too general here, I think it's important to kind of understand where the board's starting point is in all of this. And so if you think about a board's role in an organisation more broadly, it's effectively responsible for 2 things, which you can break down into more categories, but it's responsible for the overall governance, management, and the strategic direction of an organisation. And it's responsible for delivering accountable performance in accordance with the organisation's goals and objectives. And if you think about both of those things, both of them historically have been compartmentalised maybe, but today definitely involve elements of sustainability to both of them. So governance, management, and strategic direction, it's very hard for a business to talk about strategic direction these days without talking about the impact of climate risk or sustainability risk on it, or climate opportunity or sustainability opportunity. It's very hard to have an effective governance framework within a business without incorporating classic is risk, without incorporating climate risk into it. And it's very difficult to be accountable for corporate performance. Accountable to whom? Accountable to stakeholders. It's very difficult to be accountable to stakeholders these days, knowing that stakeholder groups are growing and that their interest in ESG and sustainability issues is growing as well. And so that definition isn't the AICD definition or observation, but it's almost impossible to imagine an environment in which a board's responsibilities don't take into account ESG today. Now, a few years back, we would always argue that it was really important for the board to be focusing on this for several reasons. I think we've moved beyond that, and now it's more about understanding what the board's role is in relation to sustainability. And so we have a great colleague at BDO in the US, Amy Rodgick, and Amy's the head of the Centre for Corporate Governance and does a lot of work with boards over there, and is very active in this space. And we always love learning from Amy and drawing on some of the data sets that she has, because BDO USA, just by virtue of its size, has access to a lot more information and clients when they do pulse surveys, which I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things I won't read out Amy's quote there, but you can see that what she's talking about here is that it's quite clear now that for a board to discharge its duties, it really has to have a very clear understanding of how ESG risks impact the business and what the board's going to ultimately do to manage those risks. But really, at the moment, this whole idea around how to adopt sustainability practices within a business has very clear ramifications if you're not doing it. And if a board isn't going to look at this seriously, then it runs the risk of, as we've got there, doing a couple of things. One, alienating stakeholders, drawing the attention of regulators, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, and also compromising long-term or even short-term customer and employee loyalty. Now, customers and employees are significant stakeholders in any business. Regulators are significant stakeholders in any business. But this whole idea of alienating stakeholders is much more than shareholders these days, and we've talked about this a lot. And so, your stakeholder groups include your capital providers. So they're your investors, and let's park whether super funds are different to that, because there's a lot of focus on where super funds are investing these days. You've got other shareholders, including activist shareholders, and we'll talk a bit about the role that activist shareholders are playing in this space in a minute. You've got your debt providers, your banks and other debt providers. You've got insurers. You've got organisations up and down your supply chain. You've got ratings agencies. You've got government agencies. And, of course, you've got the communities in which you operate or that you rely on for economic prosperity. So the idea of alienating stakeholders is no longer confined to alienating shareholders. It's much more broad than that. And so what we're seeing is this issue of sustainability is coming up a lot more on boardroom agendas, but it also means that directors are required to think about what it means to have ESG-related skills on the board to be able to discharge the ESG-related responsibilities that the board now has. So at a more granular level, can we go to the next slide, please, Aletta? At a more granular level, if you think about what this means in relation to specific aspects, there's kind of 6 things here that we don't need to go through in detail, but hopefully they all make sense to each of us in terms of what the board needs to think about in this space. Thrown from the top, you'll hear this a lot. It applies to all elements of corporate culture, like work health and safety, like diversity, equity, inclusion, like customer experience or customer loyalty, like bribery and corruption. If the board's communicating or acting in a manner inconsistent with the company's stated purpose or objectives, it undermines the company's ability to, I suppose, achieve that purpose or achieve those objectives. And so if the board isn't saying or acting in a way consistent with its stated ESG objectives, it's going to compromise everything that the organisation's able to do and achieve. The second one, oversight responsibility and committee structure, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail again. Boards have different options here. That they can either create a new committee to deal with ESG and sustainability, they can put it into a current committee structure, typically audit and risk, or it can be delocalized and it can be sourced or resourced across the current skill base that exists within current board members and some of the committees as well. But having a clear structure on how the board's going to maintain oversight across all of this is critically important. Identifying, monitoring, and managing non-financial risks. Now, we've talked a lot about what the non-financial risks are here, but how is the board going to make sure that the organisation is managing its climate risk? So remember, we've got chronic climate risks and acute climate risks. They're both slightly different. We've got a lot of transition risks, whether it be around policy, around technology changes, around changing consumer preferences, and we've also got liability risk, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we've got to make sure that there are appropriate frameworks in place to oversee and manage those risks. Data quality is a really interesting one. What we're seeing, I suppose, at the coalface now is having programs and processes and policies in place is absolutely critical and important, but being able to actually capture the data that you need to report or measure your performance is in some cases a lot harder than people anticipate or the boards anticipate. And so being able to put in place the controls to manage that is going to be critically important for the board as well. Management accountability. How is the board going to make sure that the ESG objectives are integrated into overall strategy within the business? And importantly, how is the board going to incentivize management to execute and deliver on ESG strategies within the business? And we've talked before about ESG linked remuneration for leadership teams, and there are various ways that that's playing out across different organisations as well. Communication and reporting, I suppose, like financial reporting, boards are also ultimately responsible for non-financial sustainability reporting. Therefore, they need to be able to track progress of their sustainability commitments. They need to effectively communicate that to, as we talked about, a myriad of stakeholders that are interested in this information. And so these are some of the things that the board needs to start thinking about if they haven't already, and about acknowledging that they have a role to play in all of this and how they're going to actually fulfill their responsibilities in relation to it. Just on to the next slide, please, Aletta. So if it's not obvious to board members, so we've put this in, we've talked a lot about the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and we've talked about it for various reasons. It's important because there's a lot of organisations in Australia and also globally that are reporting under the TCFD framework now, primarily large listed corporates, financial services institutions, and some specific sectors, extractives, oil and gas, mining, things like that. But as Aletta just mentioned about IFRS S2, which is the climate-related disclosure framework most likely to be implemented first and most likely to be adopted by ASIC as the reporting framework of choice in Australia. This is critical because this will effectively be the regulatory framework that applies in Australia going forward. And as you can see, you might remember the TCFD framework. You'll often see it pictured as 4 concentric circles. The 4 layers of the framework are 1, governance, 2, strategy, 3, risk management, 4, metrics and reporting. And under governance, this is one of the key recommendations, which is disclose the organisation's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities, but most importantly, describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So when this is mandated, companies will be required to explain what the board's role is in all of this and what their oversight responsibilities are. So even though it makes sense in the context of what a board should be doing, they're probably going to have their arm ultimately twisted here and have to report on this anyway. Not that we want regulation to drive behaviour, but it's very unlikely that a board will be able to avoid taking clear responsibility for many of these issues going forward. Next slide, please, Aletta. If it helps, again, our colleagues in the US have access to a great data set and produce a board pulse survey on a regular basis. This one is from fall 2022, or for those of us in Australia, that's September, October last year. And they have a fantastic data set to draw on in the US. So this report distills broad sentiment across, I think it's about 250 directors of public companies and what they're saying about effective corporate governance strategies. The takeaway from this is you know, this is looking from last year. This is looking at the world in a post-COVID, potentially recessionary environment. What are boards focusing on? You can see the second last one here. One of the key takeaways is that ESG continues to occupy the board agenda, albeit how they assign responsibility for it may differ across different businesses, but it's clearly one of the key things that our data is telling us that boards are focused on. And then in slightly more detail, the other thing I suppose that's interesting here is what are the steps that boards are taking in relation to ESG and sustainability, and you can see some of the data here. One of the big ones here, 49% around framework selection. What we anticipate is that will drop off because a lot of those decisions have already been made. So the SEC is very clear on how it wants to regulate this area in the US. ASIC is becoming quite clear about how it wants to regulate this area in Australia, and most other jurisdictions, the UK, Europe, and elsewhere in Asia are also very clear about how they want to do this. So we anticipate the focus will move away from that and move on to some of these other key activities here. But this is the good thing about this is consistent with many of the things that we've been saying and many of the, I suppose, observations we're making today. To the extent that boards aren't already thinking about this and thinking about their roles and responsibilities, the one thing that directors always get very concerned about is getting sued or having regulatory action taken against them. So not that we necessarily think that the stick is the right way to do this. The carrot is probably the better way to do this, but there are increasingly more and more examples of action being taken against many organisations, and it's happened internationally or globally, and it's happened in other jurisdictions a lot, but it's also starting to happen more and more in Australian jurisdictions. So, as I said, directors get very interested when you start talking about liability and potential litigation or potential regulatory action. So this is a really important conversation to be able to have with boards, although I suspect many of them are aware of some of these things. We thought we'd just give you some examples just to, I suppose, let you know the kinds of things that are happening in this space. And a lot of it is around greenwashing, but it won't always stay confined to greenwashing. But ASIC, the ACCC, many of the commissioners, chairs, deputy chairs are coming out and talking about how important this area is for them. So ASIC has already announced, well, at the end of last year, ASIC announced that it has specific priorities for this year, 2023. They include things like predatory lending, investment scams, but importantly also includes a focus on greenwashing. We know that the ACCC is also heavily focused on this. Here are some startling headlines to show the regulatory activity in this space. But just to be more specific, and just going to the next slide there, Aletta, here are some examples of things that have happened that some of you may know about, but I think are really interesting and point to what's likely to happen even more in the future. I mean, let's start with Shell, because I think Shell is a really interesting example locally and globally. So globally, you might be aware there's been an action launched against Shell earlier this year in Europe. So their headquarters are in The Hague in the Netherlands. And they have an activist shareholder that's taken action directly against that's taken action directly against the directors in their personal capacity. And they're alleging that Shell's energy transition plan is flawed and fails to manage the foreseeable risks of climate change, and they're alleging that that's putting Shell's long-term enterprise value at risk. And so they're seeking an order for Shell for the board to effectively deliver a more effective transition plan. And we don't yet know how that's going to play out. Obviously, Shell has said, this is rubbish, we're not interested, but it is a really interesting example of where it's an action by shareholders against the directors personally to do something more specific around climate change and the organisation's response to climate change. Shell's approach to kind of transition has also been picked up in Australia. So ASIC has confirmed that it's investigating Shell Australia, and it's doing so on behalf of a complaint from the Environmental Defender's Office and an industry body around communications and PR. But effectively what they're investigating is whether Shell's making misleading representations about its long-term net zero plans. They're saying, you know, Shell's giving the impression that it's taking steps to reduce its emissions, but at the same time, it keeps looking for new oil and gas fields, and it's also relying heavily on carbon offsets rather than carbon reduction strategies to achieve its transition plan. So Shell's a really interesting one. No specific outcome in Australia yet. Similarly, Vanguard Investments fined $40,000 again for greenwashing in relation to some index funds that were purporting to screen for tobacco sales, but they only screen for tobacco manufacturing companies, but we're still investing in tobacco retailing companies. But for me, it's a great example of where greenwashing is applying not only to environmental issues, but also ethical issues. Diversa Superannuation, another fine for overstating their screening or overstating their exclusions. Again, their exclusions on their website were things like polluting and carbon intensive activities, financing or supporting activities which cause environmental or social harm, and poor corporate governance. I don't know how you screen for poor corporate governance, but transpires that their actual screening wasn't as specific as what they were claiming on their website. So they were slapped with a fine from ASIC. Black Mountain Energy fined as well in relation to ASX announcements around natural gas projects being net zero. They had no basis of saying they were net zero, so ASIC slapped them. And many of you would have heard recently too that ASIC has taken action against Mercer Superannuation. Again, this is around promoting sustainable investment products, and it's a really interesting one because they were purportedly screening for or excluding businesses that were involved in not only carbon intensive fossil fuel projects, but also alcohol and gambling. Yet these investment funds had more than 15 fossil fuel companies in them, more than 15 alcohol companies in them, more than 15 gambling companies in them. And so we think there's a fairly clear outcome in store on that one as well. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? And this is all that's happened kind of in the last 6 months. And we'll see a lot more of this. And this is backed up by the ACCC's approach to all of this. So next slide, please, Aletta. So ASIC's obviously focused on corporate responsibility and corporate accountability. The ACCC is focused on consumers, right? How are consumers and individuals and households and people being impacted by what organisations are doing? So it's coming at the same problem from another side, but we know that the ACCC is very concerned about this and has talked a lot about it. Again, coming from the consumer side, they're saying things like, we know that advertising is powerful. We know that greenwashing is ultimately a form of advertising. It involves trust. It's very hard for consumers to tell just by looking at something whether or not it's true. And we obviously know that consumers are starting to make more sustainable decisions around products and services. So they're looking for things like environmentally friendly, like sustainably produced, like compostable. And so these statements or these claims are becoming more prominent, particularly on supermarket shelves. But there's this information asymmetry here because it's really difficult for consumers to verify the accuracy of any of these claims that are being made. And so they're taking leaps of faith. And so the ACCC is very interested in this. Many of you might have seen the next slide, please, Aletta. Many of you might have seen last month, the ACCC did a kind of a broad website sweep of websites across Australian businesses, but it wasn't just websites, it was also other channels through which companies advertise, including Facebook, Instagram, and there's probably some others that I'm not aware of because I'm not young enough or cool enough to know what all the latest channels are. But looking at about 250 websites, they determined that 57% of those websites, so obviously more than half of these websites are making consenting claims about environmental credentials. And they had a series of buckets into which they classified each of these things, which you can see on the right-hand side. And the biggest offenders, that's not the wording the ACCC used, that's just vernacular that I'm using. The biggest offenders were the cosmetic, clothing and footwear sector and the food and drink sector. And so you can see that this impacts a significant amount of consumers because we're all buying clothing and footwear, and some of us are buying cosmetics, and we're all buying food and drinks all the time. So the ACCC is very focused on this as well as ASIC is. So again, not that liability should be the driving force for this, but what boards and directors will find over time is that if they're not closely focused on this, and if they're not putting in place the right frameworks and the right governance processes and procedures, they'll very likely have one or more regulators start knocking on their door. That's probably enough for me, Aletta. Apologies if I've taken too long to go through that.
No, thank you very much, Ashley. I think it's really interesting to understand that what our regulators are taking more action, paying closer attention, but the regulators are only one of the stakeholders that are interested in sustainability and what an organization is doing. You know, quite a powerful stakeholder as added, but just one of the stakeholders. In the next section, we thought we'll talk about, you know, bringing the classroom to the board, and what do we mean by that? You know, I think it's really important when we look at financial reporting over the years. We've said that board directors and management rely on continuing education on all the latest accounting standards, industry trends, and they use all of that continuing education to identify and manage risks, and look at how can they improve their tools and their processes. And therefore ESG is no different. The same way directors and management would look at a new IFRS 15 around revenue recognition, or dare I say IFRS 16 around lease accounting, in a similar fashion, directors and management should also be looking at ESG, sustainability, and the new standards that we know organizations will have to deal with. What's very important is the more material an ESG risk is for an organization, the more informed and experienced the board will have to be in order to address that. So as an example, if privacy, cybersecurity is a significant issue and a significant sustainability risk for an organization, one would expect to have experienced members of the board in order to deal with that. So one would expect to see some alignment between significant risks and the skill set of the board. You know, the board could approach this challenge around sustainability in different ways, right? They could say, we want to build some of our own competency through formal training. You know, other boards have decided we want to recruit board members that have this ESG skill set already. And some boards have actually hired advisors or consultants to help them with these strategies, or maybe they've got an advisory board looking at ESG, and we'll talk about it a bit later, but some boards have as a separate subcommittee focusing on ESG and sustainability. So I think the message here is, in the same way our regulator, ASIC, have made it very clear that boards need to focus on continued education around financial reporting and industry trends. In the same way, boards should also stay up to date with the latest developments around reporting and industry trends around sustainability. Then I think it's really important that boards work closely with management. When we look at that TCFD recommendations, and if you look at the governance part, there's two parts. It's the governance from a board perspective, but also a governance from a management perspective. So not only do we need the board to have appropriate skills, we also need management to have appropriate skills to deal with sustainability. So it's important that boards as well as management have the appropriate skills to address sustainability going forward. If we look at, you know, increased stakeholder expectations, and to date, or in this webinar, we focused on regulatory expectations, but let's look at some other expectations, and specifically the expectations that these stakeholders have of the board. So if you look at investors, they would expect the board to oversee the integration of ESG into operations that support sustainable value creation and risk mitigation. So investors are saying, board, you integrate this into your strategy. Proxy advisors, they would expect the board to disclose the board's role in overseeing ESG issues or sustainability issues. So what are you, the board, doing in this space? And that lines up with the TCFD recommended disclosures. Ratings agencies would expect the board to ensure that management provides up-to-date information on all their sustainability policies, initiatives, performance. And then regulators, as we've discussed, would expect the board to ensure that organizations disclose its material sustainability risks, the impact on the business, how management is mitigating that risk, and the role of the board. So we can see the stakeholders have quite high expectations of the board around sustainability. What about management teams? So management teams would expect the board to oversee the development and the direction of ESG strategy, goals and objectives to address risk and generate value, including oversight of controls, policies, processes, metrics, incentives, and monitoring processes to execute that strategy. So even management teams, the same way they look at the board to get overall direction, they would expect that overall direction and strategy to also deal with sustainability. Employees would expect the board to establish clear communication and tone from the top, and also to hold the management team accountable for carrying through the organization's mission, their vision, values, while encouraging innovation and looking after well-being of employees. And then another stakeholder group, the final one we're looking at today, is customers and our vendors. They would expect the board to ensure that the organization produces and delivers high-quality products and services responsibly and reliably. So we can see there's a large number of stakeholder groups, and they've got very clear expectations of the board around sustainability. So if we look at how do the board respond to that, and how do the board therefore design sustainability oversight and a sustainability oversight structure? So how should the board structure this? Integrating sustainability into corporate strategy begins with establishing sustainability as a company priority. I think everybody's talking about sustainability is not an add-on, it's not a nice to have, it's integral to the strategy of the company, and more it's becoming so. So how do we establish sustainability as a priority? I think over the last number of years, when we've been speaking to boards, we've often heard the feedback that sustainability is important, ESG is important. However, we've got a lot of important things to deal with. We're dealing with a pandemic, and on the other hand, we have staff shortages, so we have to attract and retain staff. They have a lot of stuff to do. People are overworked, people are tired after the pandemic. And therefore, I think sustainability hasn't necessarily been a key priority for many organizations. However, we've seen a significant shift over the last 3 months since we've heard that mandatory sustainability reporting is a thing. It's coming globally, it's coming in Australia, and therefore I think sustainability is now moving up and is starting to become a priority for companies in Australia. Again, if you look at our governance structure, you know, some boards have created dedicated ESG committees. Other boards have said, you know, we want the full board to be across it. Some others have existed, you know, have added the responsibility for sustainability to existing board committees, quite often the Audit and Risk Committee. Now, there's different considerations to take into account on which approach is best for your board. So you should consider what is your entity's material risks, what are your existing governance structures, what are the available resources in your organization at the management level, but also, very importantly, the experience, the knowledge, and the skill set of your directors. So looking at all of those and then decide what would be an appropriate governance structure for your organization. I think what's also important is to, once you've decided on that governance structure, is to codify the specific roles and responsibilities. So assign the oversight of controls, potentially assign oversight of controls to the Audit Committee or the Audit and Risk Committee, because the Audit and Risk Committee are very familiar with looking at controls over financial information. They can also look at controls around non-financial or sustainability information. Potentially, when we look at human capital, we look at people and aligning compensation or remuneration with sustainability goals. Maybe that should go to the Remuneration Committee, which is one of the fairly standard committees of boards in Australia. And then it could be that you decide that oversight responsibilities around strategy and integrating sustainability strategy into your broader strategy should be the responsibility of the full board. So there's various options, but it's important to clearly articulate what those are. A few things to think about. How do we ensure that all the sustainability risks are identified and addressed in our strategy? How do we ensure that all of these sustainability roles and responsibility are formally established and they are executed appropriately? A very important question, does the board have the appropriate director composition to oversee sustainability matters? And we know boards often have a skills matrix, and potentially sustainability should be one of the skills on that skills matrix. How do we enable effective communication among the board, among committees, among management, actually across staff as well? How do we achieve accountability for director oversight and management execution? And also, how do we make sure that we have continuing education at the board level, but also throughout the organization? And it's not just continuing education around financial reporting, but also sustainability matters. So a few common approaches that we've seen, and we've tried to list some of the pros and some of the cons of the different approaches. And you can look at your organization and think which would work best for your organization. So you could have a dedicated ESG committee. You could add sustainability to an existing committee. You can have multiple existing committees that share the burden, and it could be a full board. So there's no dedicated committee, but the full board is looking at it. A dedicated ESG committee, obviously a benefit would be there's more time devoted to discussing ESG issues. Some of the downside might be inefficient or ineffective if it's a smaller board. And it could lead to a siloed approach to ESG, not embedded in broader strategy. If you look at an existing committee, often added to Audit and Risk Committee in Australia, it could lead to centralized, streamlined decision making. I think the benefit is the fact that we've got this interrelationship between financial reporting and sustainability reporting. So adding it to the Audit and Risk Committee might achieve some benefits. And then also a con could be that's potentially a skewed view of ESG bias towards the primary focus of the committee around financial reporting. And maybe the Audit and Risk Committee don't have the skills to deal with the E part or the S part. of ESG. Multiple existing committees, I think, obviously it could be effective integration across the whole business. A downside could be that maybe we don't have clear and defined roles, and maybe we could drop the ball somewhere. And then the full board, again, a benefit would be it's quite manageable for smaller boards. But for a downside, if it's a larger board of a larger organization, it might be that there's so many competing agenda priorities that they don't have sufficient time to deal with sustainability. So this really depends on your organization, size of your board, skills of the board, size of the organization, the existing committees you have in place, etc. But just a few ideas to think about it. So very important to document your agreed upon governance approach. So make clear if we sticking with existing board or existing committees, to update the charters to make sure people know who's responsible, and clarifying role of directors versus management teams. And if you form a new committee, all the things, draft a new charter, select appropriate committee members, etc. I think a really important part is connecting purpose and the organization's purpose to sustainability metrics and strategy. So it's really important that directors think about what is the corporate purpose of our organization and how do we incorporate sustainability and how do we connect it to our existing corporate purpose to deliver value for our organization. Also, when we set ESG objectives or sustainability objectives, it should be a complementary exercise. It should be aligning with our existing corporate purpose, or we should amend or update our corporate purpose. Important to integrate and align sustainability purpose with general overall corporate purpose. And I think the other thing to note is the board must expect sound project management, supported by processes, by controls, metrics, KPIs to drive progress in achieving these objectives. That's what the board would expect of all other initiatives, and exactly the same applies to ESG and sustainability. Important that the board continue to monitor and quantify progress and assess the risk. So the board cannot just hand it off to management. How do we monitor? How do we make sure we achieve it? In Australia, we often see, especially over the last 3 months with the imminent mandatory reporting, we see that chief financial officers are running with sustainability strategies, and previously it was chief sustainability officers. But whoever is running with this in your organization, it's a multidisciplinary team that develop strategies. We are seeing CFOs taking charge because this information will end up in financial reports. But if it's a chief sustainability officer, again, as long as they working closely together to make sure the information, so we've got appropriate strategies and it end up in financial reports. And I think the other thing is directors should be sensitive to misalignment between corporate purpose, sustainability objectives, and business strategy. We want these to be as closely aligned as possible. So maybe some key elements of an effective sustainability program. So a compelling vision and goals that include sustainability. Active, visible leadership from the top, and Ashley's also spoken about that earlier. This applies to any initiative. Active, visible leadership. Policies and procedures that sets the expectations. Training, continuous education of the board, leadership team, management, employees. Transparency and communication, incredibly important. My favorite words are transparency and accountability, and the next one is accountability, up, down, and across the organization. Incentives, compensation and benefits aligned to sustainability. If we want to make sure that management and employees align to our sustainability incentives, a really good way, or objectives, a really good way is to include it in KPIs and remuneration measures. KPI measures, data analytics dashboards, program management, and then finally, and really important, continuous monitoring, auditing or assurance, and reporting. So if a board want to implement an effective sustainability program, these are the 10 key things in our view. Again, connecting purpose to sustainability metrics and strategy. Corporate purpose and sustainability must exist in unison. A corporate purpose harmonizes value creation efforts with the organization's impact on its stakeholders. So I think a critical and a good summary of how we see the alignment between broader strategy and sustainability.
Aletta,
yes.
Sorry, I'm just wondering, is it a good time to do a quick poll and just get a litmus test?
That's a really good time.
How people feel like their own boards are operating in this space, or what level of progress they've made. I don't know if everyone can see the poll question, but just a question for all of you. How engaged is your board in various of these issues? So how engaged are they in driving sustainability across the business? Options are they're actively engaged and they are driving it. They're interested, but they're perhaps not providing the direction that they should yet. Hopefully not too many people choose this one. It's not a priority for the board yet, or some of you may be unsure. Now, obviously, we have a very deep hope that this will be answered in a way that favours the first couple of answers, but we're very curious to know how many boards are actively engaged in this space.
I think, Ashley, the other thing is it would be interesting to see whether those boards who are indeed interested are actively engaging or not really getting involved yet, so they're not providing direction yet, because it's our very firm view that boards should have it as a priority and should be actively engaged and should provide direction, right? And not just leave it to management to sort out. So it will be really, really interesting to see what people say. Thank you very much. So many people have already responded, but if you still want to add to that, and you know, please do so. We'll leave it another few seconds. Thank you for everybody that's given us feedback. I'll close it now and then I'll share it, Ashley, and we'll get some thoughts from what you think.
Well, that's good. That's absolutely a positive outcome. And I think what's interesting is, I mean, that clearly suggests that over 65% of boards are actively engaged or interested. I think what's really interesting too is there may be some boards that are interested or engaged but haven't yet got to the point where they're effectively communicating to the rest of the business what they're doing. And so it may be that some of those that are interested or that don't appear for it to be a priority are actually doing things, they're just not telling the business what they're doing. But that's just me hypothesizing. I don't know.
Fantastic. All right, so we are back to prioritizing sustainability risk. And as we said earlier, it's been really interesting that people have previously, or boards have over the last 6 to 12, 18 months told us, yes, we understand this, we're interested in it, but it just didn't make the top 5 priorities at various organizations. But we're seeing a change. I think what's important is, how do boards know which of these environmental, social, or governance factors is really material for their organization? And we've often talked about the need for organizations to do a formal materiality assessment. As you know, We often talk about all these environmental factors, and we had 8 key ones and 8 social factors and 8 governance factors. So overall 24 ESG factors, which we start with. And whenever we present to boards or finance teams, they would say, surely we can't address all of them. Correct, you can't. You won't do a great job if you focus on all of them. It's really important to articulate and identify which of those should be your focus and start with them. And the way to find out is engage with stakeholders, to solicit stakeholder input, ask them to rank those ESG factors. It's also important to do peer benchmarking. So what are your competitors doing? What are others in the industry doing? What are they focusing on? So there's a lot of stakeholders. Identify the stakeholders that's relevant to you, reach out to them, get their feedback. But then it's also important for the organization to have their own overlay. So we've got the overlay, what stakeholders tell us, but also overlay from the business on what they could impact or change over time. So really important to do a formal materiality assessment. The other thing is that assessing materiality and therefore doing a materiality, formal stakeholder engagement materiality assessment, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you do once off. You know, you might do it and update it or redo it in another year or 2 or 3 years' time, especially at a time where things are moving and developing so fast. The outcomes you might have received a year ago or 2 years ago could be very different to if you've done it today, just because the landscape in Australia has changed so much. So really important that we continue to assess materiality and risk. The other thing that I think is really important is that we shouldn't be looking at sustainability risks as a separate process to our existing enterprise risk management processes. It should be part of that. And high priority issues, clearly we have to consider how to manage that risk. And it's important for board to be aware of these systems, to consider the policies, the protocols, the controls. The same way the board would look at a risk register for the organization. So basically, sustainability risks should be part of the existing risk register, should be managed the same way all other risks are managed in an organization. Ashley talked earlier about carrots and sticks, and we like carrots and we don't like sticks, but how do we incentivize sustainability? So while senior management would drive the daily execution of sustainability agenda, it's very important that the board's role to hold management accountable ensures that sustainability is appropriately integrated into overall business strategy. Again, the emphasis on overall business strategy. So some ideas, some accountability mechanisms that the board could use. So it's just to give you a few ideas. You don't have to use all of them, but some of them might resonate with you. So you could tie management's pay to sustainability performance, and we've given you a few specific ideas. You could incorporate stakeholder perspective. You could establish clear sustainability directives, and that can help you attract and retain employees, customers, lenders, vendors, and others. And we think that's really important. You could also look very clearly at the communication protocols. And then you could also look at how do we deal with ESG or sustainability lapses. So just a few ideas around accountability mechanisms. We also want to look at reporting, data collection, and assurance. Now, data collection, I would say, is a critical issue in the preparation of sustainability reporting, and also to develop and monitor your sustainability strategies. So data collection, absolutely critical. So it's important that the supervisory role of the board is not limited to financial disclosures, but it also extends to ESG reporting and sustainability reporting. And if you look at the disclosure aspect, it's important that the board is across the latest developments around sustainability disclosures, whether it's regulatory developments in Australia, whether it is appropriate sustainability frameworks. And we know currently for 30 June, it's all about TCFD recommendations, but going forward, it will be the standards issued by the ISSB. And the board should work with management and advisors to make sure they use the appropriate frameworks, the appropriate metrics. Also important, boards should monitor regulatory developments the same way they monitor changes to accounting standards. It's important also that rating agencies are some of the most prominent ESG stakeholders. So it's important to be aware of their views and important to stay up to date around everything happening around sustainability. If we get to data collection integrity, as I say, I think this is the #1 issue. You know, enhanced disclosures build stakeholder trust. But if we've got a problem with the underlying data, this whole transparency could backfire quite nastily on organizations. So data collection and integrity is absolutely critical. So boards should look at appropriate policies and internal controls, should understand the methodology, the processes, the controls around the data collection and reporting. And the final one is interesting. The board should assess the organization's readiness and need for third-party, and there's a P missing there, third-party assurance of ESG disclosures. So often organizations would say, or, you know, organizations would communicate and publish audited financial statements. However, the sustainability information have no assurance on it. The two are sitting next to each other and it looks awkward. So I think there's this need to have audited financial statements and at least initially some assurance over sustainability information, and ultimately it will become reasonable assurance, full audit of the sustainability information. So always keep that in mind. And it's important that data collection integrity not only helps organization to report on sustainability, but it also gives board and management more confidence in the execution of their corporate strategy, which will now also include their sustainability strategy. If you want to have a little bit of a quick guide to sustainability oversight and what boards should focus on, we've tried to pick up the key things from our discussion today. So there's a one-page takeaway. Now, I'm not going to repeat all of this, but I thought it would be a good idea to just give you a one-pager to potentially put in front of your board around what would proactive ESG and sustainability oversight look like. And then where to from here? I think it's always good at the end of the webinar to ask what's next, where to from here. A reminder that sustainability is a continuous improvement journey. I don't think we'll ever get there to perfection. It's continuous improvement day to day, year to year. There are two streams, practically there are two streams that run in parallel. And there's a big focus on the measurement of carbon footprint and focusing on climate risk. And then in parallel, reporting on other sustainability information. And together that would form your sustainability reporting or your sustainability strategy. Maybe a different way to look at this continuous improvement journey. There's the initial measurement of carbon footprint, and then we implement a decarbonization strategy, and then we measure again, and then we fine-tune our decarbonization strategy, and we measure again. And we go into the circle around carbon footprint. and carbon footprint reduction. But the same could be said for the overall sustainability reporting, where you have an initial baseline report, you have some strategy on improving diversity, improving cybersecurity, improving modern slavery, etc. And then you report again. And then finally, to add credibility to this measurement of carbon footprint and your sustainability information and report, the need to have assurance over those. And this is a continuous improvement journey. We might initially have a baseline carbon footprint with no assurance, or a sustainability report with no assurance. And then we improve our systems, our processes, our data collection, integrity of data. And then we get to assurance over the next carbon footprint. So this is a diagram, maybe doing a bit of a deep dive on continuous improvement of carbon accounting. And Ashley and I have been talking about this ESG roadmap for years now, Ashley, it seems, around, if you want to start or need to start, how do we start? And what does a roadmap look like before we get to the improve? Steps 1 to 5 to get to the initial report, and then we go into that improvement and that loop of improvement. A timeline, a final reminder. 30 June 2025 seems to be the first reporting date that Australian entities or the large end of town will have to report mandatorily on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, do disclosures under IFRS S2, which means they need to be ready to capture the data, credible information from 1 July next year. So they need to know what to capture, how to capture it, have controls around it, and therefore really a call to action to start today. And then how can we help? We've got our corporate reporting insights, we've got sustainability news, and we've got a lot of information on our website. We've got e-training on the TCFD recommendations. We've got our ESG webinar series, also our IFRS webinar series, and a large team that can assist you. So thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. We hope you found it useful, interesting, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much, Ashley.
Thanks, Aletta.